Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And today we're going to have episode 12 of the shop vlog, but it's going to be a different type of episode for the shop vlog. Typically, we will take an image from start to art and go through the entire process. But I want to focus on more of the education that we can explore in today's episode of the shop vlog. Specifically, calling to an event that just occurred with one of my dear friends who has now become a student. Her name is Sherry, and we have been friends for a very long time. She's an excellent photographer and is stepping into digital photo editing, specifically using Photoshop. She's trying to get away from programs like Portrait Pro or programs that rely upon a lot of AI technology to do the heavy lifting for you. And as we've been exploring this, one of the common threads of looking at digital photo editing and stepping into Photoshop for the first time for her is how overwhelming the entire process is. She sees the art in her mind. She knows that there are multiple retouching techniques and tools in Photoshop and plugins and all these things that you can explore and should explore as you go through the process of the art creation. But when you start at the beginning, it becomes so overwhelming. So a moment of clarity that I had with her in a recent session of training, I said to her that digital photo editing is nothing more than problem solving. The entire process is simply broken down into elements of problem solving. And a way to keep you from feeling overwhelmed by all of the possibilities is to take a systemic approach to the photo editing, a systemic approach to the problem solving. Ask yourself, where are we at in the photo editing process right now? What needs to be accomplished immediately with what I see? Using the fundamentals that I talk about all the time on the channel, which is color, luminosity, and detail. Taking one of those elements, saying that's the assertion, that's the beginning spark and point of where we're going to begin the retouching process or the art creation process, and then problem solving from there. Is the luminosity an issue? If it is, what do we do to problem solve the luminosity that we see? I want more out of the luminosity. I want more out of the color in this image. How do we problem solve systemically from that starting point? So that's what we're going to do in today's episode of the shop vlog. We're going to explore an image starting with Adobe Camera Raw and simply problem solving, and then moving into the rest of the process to finish up the final artwork. So with that, let's hit the Photoshops and let the journey of episode 12 of the shop vlog begin. This is the image that we'll be working on in today's episode of the shop vlog. This again was captured by my wonderful friend Sherry Hulse with Sherry Hulse Photography. You can see more of her amazing artwork by visiting the Instagram account at the link below. So when I saw the image for the first time, I was immediately taken in by the lighting. I love this dramatic lighting pattern. It's quite beautiful. I often have talked about how I light images. I light for mood and story. I don't follow specific rigid lighting patterns where the lighting ratio must be this and the inverse square law with the tachyon pulse, deflector shields must be at. I just light what I see in my mind, knowing the limitations of my camera and what I can do with the image and the data in digital photo editing to potentially problem solve anything that was created on set. Let me give you some of the parameters of what happened with this shoot so you'll understand how we were discussing this image and how we ultimately decided to go forward with the problem solving and what we ended up with the final artwork. This was a part of a group shoot with three total photographers. Now, if you've been a part of a group shoot, it's a wonderful experience, a lot of collaboration, a lot of inspiration that you can take from one another, but also a little bit of that anxiety of hurry up because you don't want to usurp all the time and then not let the other photographers photograph. So ultimately, when Sherry was capturing these images, she was trying to hurry to get what she wanted, trying to perfect it, but move quickly. So when I looked at this and I said, I love the lighting that's coming in, I love that cascade, there's a couple of notes that I gave as far as where the model is looking and so forth to help to improve upon that. Just as a quick tip to you, the model is not really making connection to the camera very well. She doesn't need to look at the camera, but she's looking, if we zoom in just a little bit, so far away that we as the audience have a hard time connecting to her and staying with her. If she was looking, what I typically tell models is to look at my shoulder, look at the top of my head, or just look right off of my shoulder. That is letting their eyes travel away from the lens just enough that we as the audience still feel connected to them, but they're looking away and not making direct eye contact with us. Now with the lighting pattern, that soft light, I love it. The shadows, it's wonderful. What I wanted to see was a symmetry to the lighting. I ultimately wanted to see a second light brought into the scene somewhere over here with a thin strip box light modifier that would really control the throw of the light so that it would cascade light down onto her shins and her feet at the top of her knees and just travel a little bit over her body, maybe hitting her chest just a little bit. So we would have that symmetry of lighting on camera right and camera left that would ultimately illuminate the silhouette of her body, letting us see the shape. This, as it stands right now, is a very evocative image. It definitely evokes allure and sensuality. It's wonderful. But if we would have completed the equation with the lighting, it would have given us the opportunity to be able to see the full shape. We're used to seeing shapes like this, or shapes in general when it comes to boudoir photography, that can be very evocative just on its own, and that's one more puzzle piece to add to the equation to create that audience impact. And that's ultimately what was driving me to tell her that we needed that light there. Now, of course, they didn't have that option with this image. They didn't bring in another light. They were trying to hurry and so forth. So she said to me, well, you know, essentially, is this image lost? So we just toss it away. And I said, no, it's not. We're going to problem solve in Photoshop, using our knowledge systemically to fix those challenges, or to be able to recreate the data in the image to further align it to that goal of what we're trying to create and get that audience reaction. So that's where the problem solving came into play. And again, calling back to that foundation of color, luminosity, and detail. We're starting with luminosity. So just quickly, this is one of the, we're going to go through some of the Adobe Camera Raw stuff that I always do. So if you've seen this in previous videos, wonderful. If you're new to the channel, welcome. You can take a look at the card above and it will take you to the retouching series, where I definitely give you an in-depth guide on how I use Adobe Camera Raw and pretty much 80% of what you need to know of Adobe Camera Raw that you use all the time. So I'm going to come down to the Optics tab and check both of these boxes, remove chromatic aberrations, and use profile corrections. When I do profile corrections, that's going to enable the Canon camera and lenses that were used to automatically overcome some of the issues of the distortion of the glass. It also tends to make the image just a touch brighter because it's getting rid of some of the vignetting that can be caused in the lens itself. So always start there and check that. Now I'm going to come up to the basic tab, and I know luminosity is where I need to deal with this, but this is where we need to take that systemic approach in stages using smart objects, and let me explain all of that. I like the lighting right now on her face. I like the lighting pretty much, if we divide her body right down the middle, everything on camera right, I like the lighting cascade. I think it's fine. So all I'm going to do with this first smart object, or this first pass with the image in Adobe Camera Raw, is to just make sure that everything that I see on this side of the body, the right side, is good. So let's start again with luminosity values. I'm going to start pulling out the shadows just a little bit. I'm ignoring her legs and anything on this side. I'm just simply looking at the right side of the image, pulling out those shadows to see what kind of detail we can recover, mainly in the areas right here where her hair is meeting her neck and her shoulder. And then I'm going to increase the white point just a little bit across the scene. And I'm going to pull the highlights out just a little bit because some of the highlights in her hair were a little strong, but as I pull those out, I don't think that's helping us, so I'm going to increase it. I don't mind these highlights in the hair too much, but I know, problem solving, if this is the only issue right now, by pushing these highlights, I can create another smart object that will simply address this one area. So I'm trying to just keep hammering this process into you so that it sets in. If I'm working with this and saying, okay, I like the highlight slider being increased, we're at plus 20 right now, I like what I see on the face, the shoulder, this looks great, but it might start making the hair just a touch too bright. It might be causing the audience a focus distraction where they go to her hair instead of her face. Well, yes, we can use the adjustment brushes and so forth in Adobe Camera Raw, but if you've been around this channel for a while, you know I don't like using those brushes in Adobe Camera Raw, nor do I like using them in Lightroom. I don't use Lightroom to do any type of photo art editing. I prefer to do all of that in Photoshop with layers because it gives me so much more control, so many more options with layer blending modes and the other tools in Photoshop to be able to create some unique looks. So in this case, problem solving, I know that I will probably need to do another pass or another smart object that will simply address the highlights in her hair. So continuing forward, pushing those highlights a little bit more, knowing that I'm going to readdress them on the hair. I'm not going to look at the hair anymore. I'm now just looking at her face, looking at her shoulders, saying, okay, if I push it now to plus 30, is that too much? I need to take a full on look at the entire image. So I'm going to hit Control Command and the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. The highlights I think are getting just a touch too strong now. So I'm going to pull them back. Let's meet in the middle and go to plus 25. Digging what I see with the highlights, I'm going to go back to the white point now just to make sure that that can't be nudged just a little bit to get us some smooth light on her face. Again, I'm not trying to overcome any lighting or problem solve any lighting issues that I see. I'm just now prepping the file with this first pass to make this side of the body look as good as it can with all the data that we have. So I'm going to pull that white point back down pretty severely. So I'm at plus 15 right about now, and I think that looks pretty good. Now I want to pull out the black point in the scene because it's going to get us some more detail into those shadows. I don't want to eliminate the shadows. I don't want to eliminate all that rich contrast that we see by the lighting pattern. But if I can give us just a little bit more detail and take that into Photoshop as a layer, I have more control where I can paint it in strategically in certain areas to help create that visual allure. This is why I don't like using adjustment brushes in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. I need that entire layer with all the data so that I can look at it and say, I'm going to use a layer mask and bring in some of that extra detail strategically in certain areas. This is the systemic approach to problem solving with the photo editing. So the black point being pulled out a little bit, I think helps. The contrast, I am going to pull that down just a little bit too. This has been my practice, regardless of whether this image, most images, I'm lately pulling the contrast out a touch instead of increasing it, because contrast definitely addresses the luminosity values and makes things feel more contrasted, but it also increases the color. It tends to burn the color a little bit, whereas contrast is kind of broken down into the white and black sliders here, where you can get some of that contrast value, but it's restricted to luminosity and we're not seeing those color changes. So that's why I've lately been pulling the contrast out to a negative number. Right now I'm at negative 17. And then to compensate, I will increase the black point. Right now it's a plus 30. This black slider is like golf. So if you want more black into the black point on the image, you got to take it to the left and get to that negative number. So in this case, I pulled out the black point because I want to see that detail. This could be another reason to create another smart object because I'm problem solving, right? But in this case, I don't think that's necessary at this stage. I'm approaching the entire art edit systemically. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you, but think about it from that process. Systemic approach to problem solving. If I'm taking the contrast out, which is lessening some of that contrasted value in the entire scene, well, I can compensate for that, as I just said, by increasing the black point. But I just took the black point out because I want to see more detail. So I need to problem solve that later in the process. I don't need to problem solve it here at this stage in the Adobe Camera Raw prepping of the file. So I'm storing away in my little noggin that later on in the Photoshop editing, I need to address contrast again. I could simply bring the image back into Adobe Camera Raw as a filter and increase the black point. I can use a brightness and contrast adjustment layer in Photoshop, curves adjustment layer, levels, all kinds of ways to solve it. I simply know that I need to problem solve it, but I need to do it later, systemically in this part of the process. So we've addressed the luminosity values, the color values. Let's come down to the color mixer and address those independently with each one of these channels. The color mixer, this is new to Photoshop, Adobe Camera Raw, Photoshop CC, blah, blah, blah. But I'm using Photoshop CC 2020, and you have an option. The old view in Adobe Camera Raw used to be the HSL or hue, saturation, luminance sliders. This is all that you would have. If you're using a newer version of Photoshop, just simply come to here where it says adjust and click to the color. Now you get the same exact controls. It's just a different interface and a lot more user-friendly to use. So I'm on the orange channel. As I've said in many different videos on this channel, every human being, regardless of your ethnicity, you have the colors yellow, orange, and red in your skin tone, predominantly orange. So this control here is so much better to use if you need to address the color orange, either from a saturation perspective, a hue perspective, or a luminance perspective. So in this case, I actually want to increase the luminance of the color orange. Why? Because it's going to start making all these areas just a little bit brighter that we were addressing under the basic tab here. I'm problem solving. I want some of that light to be just a little bit brighter, both in the areas that are properly illuminated by the light on set and some of those shadow regions. Because in the shadows, her skin has orange, yellow, and red into it. So if I increase the luminance values of the color orange, it's going to help me with that issue of seeing more detail in those areas. Now I'm bouncing it back and forth. This is one of my typical practices that I talk about in the retouching series. I very rarely take a slider all the way to the left or to the right because it's not giving you a realistic view of what you're really seeing. The only time I ever do that is just so I can understand what the slider does if I'm not familiar with it. But in this case, I'm going to keep bouncing it back and forth. And what I'm doing is my eyes are looking here on her face to see if it's blowing out those highlights, and looking across her torso just to see if we're getting more light in some of those shadowy regions that I'm trying to address. So as I continue to push this, I am getting just a little too much light on her face, so I don't want to go too far with it. But I think a gentle little push of this is going to help. So we're at plus 20 right now. One of the key things I always say is subtlety is key inside of Photoshop. So in this case, I don't want to go too far with it, but a gentle push certainly gets us a little bit closer to our goal. So the saturation, I think, of the color is fine. I'm going to come to the color yellow and take the saturation all the way out. This is so I can see how much yellow is actually in the image. It's really just in her hair, a little bit in her skin, but mainly in her hair. So I think this is fine to push up just a little bit to saturate that color. I don't want to take the saturation all the way to 100. Actually, I take that back. It doesn't look that bad. It looks good in her hair, but it might be a problem with her skin. So we're in the systemic approach. We're just preparing the file to take it into Photoshop. Don't think we need to worry about that too much. So I'm going to pull that yellow saturation back to plus 20. Sounds good to me. The hue, I'm going to shift it just a few points toward orange. We're taking yellow, and we can either go toward orange or we can go toward green. I'm taking it toward orange just a little bit. So we're at -6, and I think that's pretty good there. Don't need to address the color red because it's really only going to be in her lips. We can look and see if we desaturate it, if we see any splotches of red in her skin that need to be addressed. I'm actually seeing her right hand that's back here in the scene. That's actually got a little bit of red in it. Usually appendages do. Hands and feet always have a little bit more red. This is where blood is pooling in the body, a little bit more potentially. So we can pull some of that down and maybe increase the luminance of red just a little bit to help some of these areas of her hands and her feet come into play just a touch more. So we've addressed color, we've addressed luminosity. The detail at this stage and the systemic approach of photo editing doesn't need to be addressed, because we still need to do a retouch. If we start increasing the texture, the clarity, the sharpness, and so forth, we're only going to compound to the issues that we need to work with in the retouching process. Let me take a step back here. When I work with an image in Adobe Camera Raw for the first time, my goal is not to beautify the image. My goal is not to make it finalized artwork right here in this program with this first pass. I'm working systemically through the issue, or through the image and the challenges that are presented with the image. So I want to work on that detail later in the process, later in the systemic approach, not right now. So at this stage, I think this first pass is ready to go. We need to make a second smart object and come back in here and start looking at her legs that didn't have the light on it. So to make this a smart object and open it into the Photoshop, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and down here at the bottom right now, when it's open, it just says open, but when I hold the Shift key, it will say open object. So now I click it, I will have a smart object and my layer stack here. That's indicated by this little icon, and that the name of the file is the actual name of the layer. It doesn't say the word background. Now I'm going to right click anywhere on this layer where there's not words or picture, and that's going to bring up this menu with a whole bunch of different options. I'm going to come down to new smart object via copy. That's going to make a second smart object that is not linked to the original one. If you simply just duplicate the smart object by hitting Control Command and the letter J, you're going to have two smart objects that are linked together. So when you make changes to one, both of them are affected. I don't want that. So now that I have a second one that is not linked, I can double click on the picture, the thumbnail, that'll pull it right back into Adobe Camera Raw, right back where we were just a moment ago. Now, I can ignore this entire part of the image because I'm problem solving. I know this looks good. This is the part of the image now that I need to focus on. So, ignoring all the blown highlights that we're about to see, I'm going to globally increase the exposure. Just a quick side note, I've talked about this in previous videos on the channel, that when we look at color, luminosity, and detail, and we think, okay, we got to make the image brighter. A lot of folks will think they need to come to the exposure slider and just simply increase the exposure. It's not the place to start, because it's a global change to everything. We've looked at the ways we can control highlights with whites and black sliders, highlights and shadow sliders. The colors themselves have luminance sliders. These are the places to start if you need to increase the light in your image before you go to a global adjustment like exposure. But in this case, I'm going to go to exposure because this is in such a shadowy area, because there's no light on it, that I need that global change. And I know I'm going to be painting that section in using a layer mask in Photoshop. So I'm going to increase the exposure significantly. I'm ignoring all these blown highlights, but really that actually doesn't look that bad. If I were to decrease the highlights just a touch, that's not a bad looking image. It looks fine. But what's happened? The entire mood has changed because the lighting, all the shadows are gone now. We don't have those shadows anymore. That's how important it is to light as a photographer to help create that mood, to augment the story that you're trying to tell. So in this case, I know that I'm losing those shadows, not a big deal, because I'm going to be painting this in using a layer mask selectively. Again, just to continue to drive this nail into the coffin of why I don't like to use the adjustment brush. I want that layer in Photoshop. I want that layer mask. I want the ability to use a pressure sensitive tablet like a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet and the pen so I can gently start painting it in. Artistically create the light and shadow I'm looking for instead of using an adjustment brush, because that just as silly. So the exposure's been increased significantly. I'm going to push the highlights back up. Again, I'm just looking at her legs. That looks pretty good. I'm going to push that white point up just a little bit more, and I'm going to increase the black point just a touch because I want some of those shadows to be there and some of that richness. Let's go back out just a little bit. We're at plus 12 now. I think we're at like 20, 25 plus 20, 25 on the black slider. I think that's pretty good right there. Let's come back to the color mixer, go to the color orange, increase that luminance significantly. Ooh, I'm liking that a lot. That's helping out more than what we were getting with highlights. So I'm going to pull the highlights back just a little bit. And why am I pulling the highlights back? Well, I know that I'm going to start painting this in using a layer mask. Now, the way to make this look like it was all real on set is to not just stop at her knees. I have to feather in transition. As I feather in transition, if the highlights here are blown out in Smart Object number 2 compared to Smart Object number 1, then that's going to create a new problem that I have to problem solve. So in this case, I'm saving myself from dealing with that problem by feathering it and making everything look pretty smooth as we transition. So the highlights are pretty good there. I'm going to go ahead and pull that contrast out just a little bit more. The rest I think is fine. So with those changes made, all I have to do is come down here and hit OK. And that's going to process and then readjust this smart object that is not linked to the bottom one. So if I turn this one off, that was the first pass we made. Here's the new one. And again, just a quick testament. See the power of those shadows and the story that it tells with that lighting. We completely eliminate all those shadows by looking at the image this way. It's still a pretty image, but it's just not the same story to me. So now, to paint this in, I'm going to put a layer mask onto this layer, but I need to use a layer mask that hides this entire layer so I can strategically paint it in on the mask. That means that I need to use a hide all layer mask or a black layer mask. To create that, I'm going to come down to this icon at the bottom of the layers window. This is the layer mask icon. If I hold the Alt or Option key and click it, it will automatically make a black mask or hide all. Now all I have to do is paint white onto this mask to begin to reveal it wherever I want to see. So I'm going to be using a soft edge brush. My opacity is set to 100% and my flow is set to 5%, and that's a good place to start. Again, I am using a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet. It has pressure sensitivity, so the lighter that I put the pen to the tablet, the lighter that brush is going to interact with that layer mask in Photoshop. So let's zoom in just a little bit and start painting gently and bringing in that light that would have occurred in the scene if there was another strip box there with the lighting. Now I'm feathering it as we travel over the leg, and I'm feathering it down just a little bit because I wouldn't mind the top of her legs having just a little bit more light. Now that we've made that change, I'm looking at that rim light. Again, the whole goal here was to create a suggestive shape that falls into the story and helps augment it. So I'm going to travel up her torso just a little bit, up her chest just a little bit, and then I don't think I want to hit her face, but maybe just a little bit here on her neck, just so we have just that hint of rim light. And in a way, if you think about the lighting pattern, if there was a decent strobe here with, let's say, a 12 by 55 inch strip box from Strobe Pro, which is the ones that I use all the time, then it would cascade down and hit the legs. That would be the hottest point of light because that's the closest object to the light. But it would have fallen off and traveled, so we would get just a gentle little hint of light as it traveled and fell off across the scene. So in this case, I'm trying to help create some of that realism by just gently painting in a little bit of light. You may hear me using my keyboard. I'm using the right and left bracket keys to make the brush size bigger or smaller. My typical practice is to keep my left hand on the keyboard and use all the hotkeys that I need to for the various tools that I'm using. And then I'm using my right hand with the Wacom Intuos Pro tablet. Okay, and I'm filling in just a little bit of these shadows, a little bit here at the top of the left side of her chest, maybe just a little bit of her tummy, right down where her legs meet her pelvis. Give her a little hint of light there. And then I'm going to hit her forearms here and her hands, because keep in mind, this side of the image was way blown out, right, with a lot of light. So we can use that to our advantage, again, with a low flow of 5%, strategically working it into the scene to call attention to wherever we need it to be with light and shadow to help tell that story. Problem solving across the entire way. Hitting just the light sides of her face just a little bit more, maybe taking it off her forehead just a touch. Now hitting Control Command on the number 0 to zoom all the way back out. Here's where we were. Here's where we are. So before and after. Now, obviously I painted outside the lines so that we can see some of the background has been eliminated. Is that a bad thing? Yes and no. Yes, because we need to fill in the rest of the background to make it brighter. Why would we want to do that? If we create separation with lighting on the background so that the subject separates from the background, they visually are away from it. There's a different quality to light or color or the shape that separates the background. It helps us to see that shape even more. Now, this is a dark scene in the background. If we were to make it brighter, then the shadows that are on her body stand out even more. But the shadows that are on her body are mixing with the shadows in the background, making it harder to make out the shape of her. So what I would want to do is to make a selection of her and protect that selection and then paint on the outside of it to illuminate the background itself. Let me show you how to do that in a very easy way. I'm going to come up to Select and down to Select Subject. That's going to let Adobe Sensei or Skynet decide what the subject is in the image. And it made a pretty good selection of her. There's a few little gaps back here that's easy to fix later in the process with the layer mask. But ultimately, we have a good selection around her. So with that selection in place, keep in mind, everything right now inside the marching ants is what is actively selected. So if I were to start painting on the layer mask to reveal more of the brightness of this smart object, we would only see it inside the marching ants. I need to see it outside. So I need to invert this selection. And to do that, I'm going to hit Control, Shift, and I for invert, or Command, Shift, and I on a Macintosh. Now, painting white again, making my brush really big, using the right bracket key. I'm just going to start painting white onto the layer mask around that perimeter edge. And I'm just jittering my pen back and forth just to gently spread this out. Again, pressure sensitivity is coming into play here, and trying to add in as much light onto that background as I can, and a little bit on the floor to help separate her from the background. Keep in mind the shadows are still in play on her body because we protected her with this selection that we inverted. Okay, now to get rid of the selection, I'm going to hit Control or Command and the letter D for deselect. The last thing that I want to do here is I'm going to collapse both of these layers down, which means I'm going to be working destructively. Destructively means that I'm making permanent changes to the layers that once I go past a certain amount of history states in my Photoshop, that I will not be able to go back to this one step. So I do advise to not work destructively on an image if you're working for like a commercial company or doing something where you need a lot of different saved states of the file. When I'm working for my own personal artwork or something like this image, I don't mind working destructively by flattening all the layers down. So I don't really need to flatten the layers for what I want to do next. So now that I've said all of that, I'm going to flatten it. It's my picture, my video. I can do what I want. So I'm going to come up to Layer and come down to Flatten Image. Now they are both combined into one layer. Also, what just happened is they are now no longer smart objects. I cannot double click on any one of them or the one layer that's left now and go back into Adobe Camera Raw. So that's another thing to consider when you are using smart objects right out of Adobe Camera Raw. Once you get those two files set to where you need to be, then you flatten, you can't go back in that format. So the question obviously will be, well, then why flatten? You can always go back if you want to, yes. But you will get to certain stages of the editing process or the artistic process where having smart objects might actually cause some issues with different steps and different filters and so forth in Photoshop. Keep in mind that some of the filters to this day in the current version of Photoshop is Photoshop CC 2021, which I'm not using because it's full of bugs. Some of the filters that are available don't work on 16-bit images and they won't work on smart objects. So chances are not high that a smart object will cause an issue to you, but for my process, I typically just flatten and move on. The reason why is because if I don't force myself to move on and I leave myself a bunch of options, I will mess around with this photo until the end of time, because I might be touched with perfectionism just a little bit. I'm not sure. What I want to do finally with this is to straighten out this image. So, because it's just a little bit tilted to one side. So I need to unlock the layer by clicking this icon, which will turn it from a background layer to layer number 0. I'm going to hit V for the move tool. And then I'm going to make sure that my rulers are active. The rulers are active here on the edges. If you don't see rulers, simply come up to window and then come down to, not window, view, I'm sorry. And then make sure that rulers is checked. So again, view and come down to rulers and you'll have the rulers. You can either have them as inches or pixels or these other options of different measurement points. I prefer inches. So with the ruler active, what I can do is drag down a line. So all I'm doing is clicking anywhere on the ruler. It doesn't matter what number. I'm just clicking on it one time and holding down my mouse button. And then I'm dragging down and I'm creating a straight horizontal line. And I'm going to match it up right here where the floor connects. Then with my move tool active and on the move tool, making sure this is checked, it says show transform controls. I will see all the transform controls of the bounding boxes around the entire perimeter. So if I position my mouse to the corner, it switches from that arrow to those two little arrows. I can now rotate the image and start trying to line it up. I'm going to move it upward and match up this corner here and that corner to make sure that they run across that even straight line that I made with the ruler. Then I'm going to I come up to one of these corners again. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. If I hold the Alt or Option key on any corner transform control, if I'm holding Alt or Option, it will resize all of them at the same time. And I'm going to resize until all of the data goes off the entire perimeter of the document. So right here is where we're just past the edge of the document itself. To make sure that looks pretty good. Then I'm going to hit Enter to accept the transformation. Last little thing that I want to do, I'm actually need to nudge this up just a little bit. And then as you can see, the more I nudge it, the more that I'm losing that data. There's ways to problem solve that, but we're not going to explore that in today's video. So the last little thing that I want to show you, and last thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to create a thirds grid. This is essentially evoking the rule of thirds, which is one of the basic steps that you need to look at in learning how to compose images during photography. So in this case, I want to make sure that she is fitting into the thirds purposefully and that it looks good. In this case, we're almost there. I want her face to intersect with one of these quadrants where one of the thirds, vertical and horizontal, meet up. So in this case, her face is almost there. So I'm going to move the image down just a little bit and move it over so that one of her eyes is going through the line. And the general section of her face, it's not like her nose has to meet right at the point of these two rulers, but as long as her face intersects this section somewhere, then we have harmony in the composition. Her face is here, a good portion of her body is right in the middle, and her feet are over there. There's something of interest of her in every one of the sections of this rule of thirds, except for this little square up there. This is a lonely little square that will have no cakes today. So ultimately, the thirds look good. Everything is fine. This is composed well. This is where I'm going to stop for this episode of the shop vlog. There's much more work to do of retouching and color grading, of cloning in the background and so forth. So what I want to know from you all in the comments below, is that something you would like to see? Because again, I've been asking a lot of the videos lately on the channel what you want to see and what content is good for you. So if you would like to continue to see more of this image and further editing of this, let me know in those comments below. So let's finish up this video today with some final thoughts about problem solving and strategic work, strategic, systematic approach to photo editing. The goal is very clear. Digital photo editing can be overwhelming. There is so much to learn and explore in Photoshop. If you begin with that systemic approach, asking yourself every step of the way, what do I need to do right now? What is the one thing I'm going to focus on in this? If your eyes are drifting to the brightest part of the image and you think that's a problem solve it. What are the ways to problem solve it? Adjustment layers, Adobe Camera Raw, masks. Once you've problem solved it, systemically move forward to the next thing that you see. This will become a repetitive pattern that you will be able to move through so quickly that digital photo editing an image like we just saw can be done in 20 minutes. When you know the tools, when you ask yourself why things work in Photoshop and spend the time to learn that, approach everything systemically, and problem solve all the way. If you like the content you found in today's video, please give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because new content will debut each week in photography and Photoshop education. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you want to see, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.